So today we're going to talk about managing uncertainty and expectations in the building and design and construction process. As Annalisa referred to, I'm Steve Jones with Dodge. I've been there for about 10 years now, but I come out of architecture as my background before that and some years in technology. Those of you who are familiar with our SmartMarket Report series will probably seen some of these, and I refer the rest of you to the analytics store.construction.com because we do I guess probably 8 or 10 of these every year, and they're all free because they're sponsored by various players in the industry. And so I would send you there, and you can find very interesting information that we do and research on all kinds of topics. The one that we're going to talk about today is just a couple months old, and it's about managing uncertainty and expectations in the building design and construction process. The founding partner for this was the AIA Large Firm Roundtable, and they've been working on this idea very seriously for the last 5 or 6 years. It seems that the standard of care among owners is perfection. When you turn over a set of construction documents to be bid and then built off of, it seems that everybody expects those to be perfect. So part of the issue is they can't be perfect, right? We're creating one-of-a-kind prototypes and building them outdoors in crazy conditions with groups of people who've probably never worked together before. So how can perfection be expected? But although we all face that, and nobody really wants to talk about it. You know, I was an architecture principal with a big firm for 19 years, and I certainly never won a project by going in and telling an owner, oh, by the way, you're probably going to have about a 4% cost overrun just because there's unavoidable mistakes and errors in my drawings. Is that okay with you? You never talk about that, and contractors don't really talk about that either in terms of coordination errors and in terms of mistakes that they may make at the site, which are almost impossible to avoid, but nobody ever wants to talk about it. So the AIA Large Firm Roundtable took it upon themselves to lead a group, and we got the AIA themselves involved, Autodesk is involved, the Design Build Institute of America is involved, the AGC is involved, GraphSoft's involved, and the Lean Construction Institute all got together and funded this research to say, could we put some specificity around what is a normal expectation? And let's stop pretending that perfection is the appropriate standard of care, because it just isn't. And so I've never been involved in anything like this. I've lived the problems, as all of us have, of the kind of unavoidable problems that happen on projects. But I'm very excited about having been involved in this, what I'll consider to be the first step in trying to shed light on this issue. So let me take you through what we set out to do. First thing we did was really attack the idea of uncertainty. Which aspects of uncertainty really have the most negative impact on projects? And then of those, of the most important ones of those, what's actually driving those? And then are there some tools or processes that are available that anybody that we're surveying has ideas about to mitigate their impact? Then secondly is that idea of performance. You know, is perfect performance realistic? And so we captured a lot in terms of varying perspectives of both owners and designers and contractors on their own and on each other's levels of performance on projects, and what are the most meaningful aspects of that and how they should be measured, and then how all parties can really much more productively align around what are reasonable expectations as opposed to holding perfection as the standard. So the hope that we had for this was to give everybody, all of you, everybody in the industry, some objective data so you can initiate an actual, honest, mature, grown-up discussion with a client early in the process and acknowledge the fact that you're building a one-of-a-kind prototype outdoors with a lot of baked-in uncertainty. It is inevitable, and that there is a range of reasonableness around the cost and performance impact of that uncertainty. And what would then be realistic performance expectations between all parties on this particular project that we're all about to embark on? Is there new design solutions? Is it a tight labor market? Is it an accelerated schedule? Is it a difficult site? Are we doing anything unusual that's going to create more uncertainty? Let's acknowledge it in advance and not wait until it causes a problem where everybody else is expecting perfection all the time. And then what are the top factors to pay attention to? And then what are the ones that really don't move the needle, so the team can identify and manage risk rather than avoid and transfer. You know, so much of the contracting strategy in our industry is all about avoiding and transferring risk. And, you know, we're taking the position that it's much better to identify it and manage it. And then what opportunities do we have to mitigate that and improve performance? So we're hoping to establish the groundwork here with what I'm calling taking the invisibility cloak off of the elephant in the room around uncertainty and performance. And hopefully we're going to take it to a next stage beyond this. So I'd be interested in anybody's thoughts afterwards about that. So here's how we did it. We did it with 3 different parts. We did an association survey. We went out to all those associations you saw, plus a bunch of others, and said, could we send out a survey to your members? And we got over 2,500 responses back from owners, architects, and contractors. And that was really to try and identify what were the major issues that we should focus on in the next round. So the next round was a telephone survey, and that's really in research how you get your best results, because people are guaranteed to complete it, and you can really capture all the nuance of their answers. And so we took those targeted top issues that came out of the association survey, and we did this targeted phone survey. 155 owners, 82 architects, 72 contractors, all in the United States. We did a representative range of company sizes and the project types that they worked on, and we made sure that most of these folks are involved. At least half of their work is complex projects, because that's where you tend to get most of the uncertainty and then most of the problems. Parallel to that, we put together an owner's advisory group, and this was a really interesting aspect of this. We got 7 owners, each from a different building type. You see the companies there. And we asked them to both give us input on the survey that we put together, and then when we got the findings back before we did the SmartMarket report, we shared those findings with them, and we had long sessions with every single one of them to get their thoughts on each of the aspects. And we've woven that through the report. We've woven their comments in throughout the whole report, and as you see today, I'll show you some of the highlights of that. So the report itself is broken into 3 major pieces. There's the understanding uncertainty, then there's dealing with performance expectations and the metrics thereof, and then lastly, there's opportunities for performance improvement. And so I'll take you through some of the highlights, but again, I encourage you to take a look at this. Annalisa is going to send it to you, PDF version. Take a look at this, share it within your firms, and hopefully you'll find things you could begin to take to your owners and begin that discussion ahead of problems on projects. So let's look first at understanding uncertainty. What are the top drivers, and how is it specifically impacting quality, cost, and schedule? So this survey, we went out on that big survey with 12 different causes of uncertainty. We asked people to rate them for us. And it was pretty interesting because they broke down, the top 7 really came out very strongly, and there was a big drop off to those you see over there on the right, which really weren't rated as things that move the needle in terms of causing uncertainty. So when you look at those 7, they're also pretty interesting because they tended to break down into groups. 2 of them were very clearly owner issues, owner-driven changes to the program or design during the project, and setting an accelerated schedule. 2 of them were definitely architecturally related, design team related, design errors and design omissions. 2 of them were very much about the build team, coordination problems, and then contractor caused delays. And then the last one is really what I call a non-aligned cause. I mean, it's unforeseen site or construction issues, things nobody anticipated, but when they happen, you have to deal with them. And those are the top 7 out of the 12. So we dealt with those more specifically in the phone survey, and that's what's in the report. So you'll see, I'll use through this presentation, and you'll see in the report itself charts like the one you see on the right here. So let me explain a little bit how they work. So as you look at them, you'll be able to follow them a little more clearly. What they do is they rate, we ask people in most cases to rate on a 1 to 5 level, either from no impact to low impact, moderate, high, or very high. And what you'll see here on all these charts is the percentage that were a 4 or a 5 out of 5, a high or very high impact. So that's what the percentages represent. And the colors, the dark bar are the owners, the tan bar is always the architects, and the red bar is always the contractors. And then you'll see in the yellow boxes, I'll show you some of the quotes that I pulled out from the report from the various advisory group members. So let's look at these 7 causes and how people reacted to these 7 causes of uncertainty. Everybody pretty much agreed that those unforeseen site or construction issues are really important. That was the #1 for owners, it was the #1 for contractors, and it was still the #3 for architects. But then you begin to get a little bit more interesting difference of opinion and perspective here. When you go down now to the architecturally oriented, the design team oriented ones with design errors and design omissions, you'll see that they're tied for #2 and 3 for owners and #1 and 4 for contractors, but they're cited last by design firms. And it isn't that they don't care about those. I don't want that to be the impression here, but it's definitely that they see that the role of the owner and the role of the contractor is far more impactful And it's interesting to note when you look at the contractors' responses that they're a little bit more concerned about missing scope and omissions than they are about errors. And beginning here with some of the quotes, Craig Russell, Disney, they do a lot of interesting projects there, and they're trying to do unique design solutions in many cases. And what he says, quite interestingly, is sometimes it's a design error, not a design error, on things which were well-intentioned during the design, but they just didn't work out in the field, because everybody kind of owns that one. But taking the opposite view would be John Mobies, who's our retail owner from Crate and Barrel. He goes, there just never seems to be a design error, even in things like roofing or flashing or other things where it's just clearly been designed wrong. Whether it's not a professional, whether it's an architect or an engineer, just nods their head and says, yeah, the ball got past the goalie on that one. So he's not seeing a lot of fessing up. When you get to the contractor cost delays, they're actually relatively low in terms of the impact by everybody. And John Mobies says contractors a little bit more upfront, saying, yep, that was wrong, we'll go fix it. Now when you get to the owner ones, those are rated low by owners. Their owners are more keen on basically pointing out the problems caused by architects and contractors. So you're seeing that there's a little bit of the finger pointing going on and people not quite ready to really fess up to the impact of their own controlled causes. And our manufacturing owner said maybe it's denial. If you make a change, it's like, oh, this can't be a big change, but the owner might not get that it has more repercussions. So things like this can be extremely valuable to share with your owners. We're getting these guys to really go on record speaking with the perspective of owners about these things. And John Moby says owners grow a little numb, maybe even callous to shortening schedules and budgets without adjusting the program. So what we did for each of these things is we asked people how frequently does it occur and what's a typical percentage impact on cost. Because if it doesn't happen very often, even if it's impactful on cost, it's not something that the industry needs to focus on, and vice versa. So what we tried to figure out here was which things happen a lot and are really impactful. So we developed this frequency cost index to assess the criticality of each of these top 7. And we spread it out over a 1 to 100 scale. So you'll see that the owner-driven changes are really the killers here. Definitely the top thing. And the next is kind of a cluster in the middle with design omissions and design errors, and then the unforeseen conditions along with construction coordination. Accelerated schedule, although it does create problems, actually scored on that frequency index relatively low. So what we did was we took a deeper dive behind both the owner program changes, the specific design errors and omissions, the frequency of those, and then the drivers behind construction coordination issues. Because in order to understand these, it's important to see what it is on the owner side, what it is on the design team side, and what it is on the construction side that's actually driving these things. So in terms of that owner change, unclear project requirements from the owner at the outset was number 1. Budget and schedule changes during the course of the project, number 2. Things which came in lower than that were things which I think of tend to be kind of more internal issues, new functions at the owner, owner changes in their own staff, owner organizational changes and things like that. They're not necessarily project things. So clearly the ability to put out good requirements at the outset and not change things as you go through the project are the most important aspects. And here, John Moby saying it's a huge Pandora's box for uncertainty, negative impact on cost is something the owner needs to be very cognizant of as owner changes in staff. So in terms of the frequency, we didn't get into the reasons why design errors and omissions occur because that is a huge study all in and of itself. But we did get perspectives on how frequently you're seeing it take place on projects. And there's quite a huge discrepancy we found here between the frequency reported by contractors of errors and omissions in contract documents versus the perception of the frequency by design firms, in some cases as much as a 5x delta. So, we're not here to say one party's right or one party's wrong, but what we're pointing out here for the first time, I think, ever with some quantitative detail is the degree of discrepancy that exists between the major players on projects in terms of how they view very important aspects like this, which again is going to be helped so much by having a mature discussion in advance about how to deal with the inevitability of these kinds of problems. Chuck Hardy from the GSA, as a public owner, he says, trade contractors think it's like getting a set of instructions to build a model from a hobby shop, and it just doesn't work that way. And Don Vitek from Whirlpool saying that the contractor is looking for 100%, but it's just not realistic. So again, I think quotes like this from very well-known owners can be extremely educational for the owners that you work for. And then around the coordination issues, the factors frequently contributing to that, you're clearly seeing that the contractors are pointing very hard at the individual trades. But then you've got John Moby saying, in a design bid build situation, you're bringing the trades in so late, you can hardly blame them for the fact that a lot of the problems end up on their plate. And then you're seeing here an interesting thing where these are clearly contractor issues, but they're relatively willing, as willing as others, to basically kind of point to themselves, in most cases more willing than others, to point to themselves on that, scope gaps, lack of planning, and misinterpretation of design documents. So again, I think the contractors are a little bit more willing to step up and express ownership in their contribution to driving problems. And then there's exterior factors, labor and market changes, and the bidding and contract award, which nobody feels are really the most driving factors. So then we got into the question of who is it that benefits the most from uncertainty? Does anybody benefit? And it seems that a lot of people think that the general contractor does, especially owners and architects. Contractors don't really agree at 18%, but it seems to be the majority position here that the GC does. Where the GC is going to point to is the trade contractor, interestingly. And nobody really much thinks that any of the rest of the players on the team, architects, engineers, especially, really benefit from uncertainty. So next what we want to do is take a look at what all this means for performance expectations and what ought to be measured. We started out by asking about owners' perceived satisfaction. And this is pretty interesting because all of us would like to think on the design and construction side that we're providing a really high quality to our owners all the time and that our owners are pretty satisfied all the time. And so what you'll see here is pulled out of the report is for the instance of quality. If you look at the blue wedge, that's the always. That's, what percentage do you believe are always satisfied with qualities? And owners say that they're always, only 20% of the owners said that they're always satisfied. And actually 14% said they had pretty low satisfaction with quality. And then you look at the perception of those who are providing it, half of the people think that they're always providing that. It gets a little bit more extreme when you get into cost, where only 11% feel like they're always satisfied with cost among the owners. Yet 31% of architects and contractors think that they're always providing satisfactory cost. And Chuck Hardy, you hear saying, architects and contractors are saying, hey, we handled this uncertainty as perfectly as we could, mitigated the risk as best we could, but hey, the cost was still added. But owner project teams and their hierarchies upward don't like to take this into the board to explain what happened. And then you look at schedule, where only 12% of owners say that they're always satisfied with schedule, and actually 36% have a pretty low satisfaction level. Or again, more than a third of architects and contractors believe that they're providing that. So again, we're not here to say one side's right and one side's wrong. What we're here to say is there's an awful lot of stuff we're not talking about. And as you sit around the table with all the other players on a project team, you have to realize the perspective they're bringing to this. And they almost have an expectation of problems occurring around certain things, and that there's differences in those perspectives. And it's important to get at this stuff early and talk it out, because here's quantified information to show you just how differently, in this case, owners and then the design build teams feel about the level of satisfaction owners are getting. And Don Vitek puts it pretty well. He says, even though it ends up being delivered on the agreed upon schedule, it may have been revised several times, and that poor owner rep got beat up several times, and so he still has a bad taste in his mouth. So then we get into more of the issues of performance and what is it to be high performing, and what is it about performance that ought to be measured, can be measured, is most easily measured, and most meaningfully measured. And there's varying perspectives. We start here with the design teams. The ability to develop documents is absolutely everybody's number one thing that are constructible and meet the program requirements. And then secondly, very interesting, is much more about the attitude and collaborative nature of working together as a team, the ability to solve issues without escalating them to the owner. Came out as the second thing that people think are the most effective things to measure in terms of design firms. And Chuck Hardy says, you know, if you hit those two, all the rest of these things are going to come in line. The rest of them are more quantified things, the number of or the percentage of, in terms of change orders and contingency use and things like that. You're seeing these red lines a little bit longer. The contractors are a little bit more comfortable holding design teams to that. You're seeing the tan lines being the shortest because the design teams are basically least comfortable being held to those kinds of numerical quantified things about their performance. And then the number of change orders actually, thankfully, came in pretty low because, as most people will agree, it's not really a very legitimate way to measure performance pretty much of anybody, because change orders can be generated by so many different things. Then we get into, in terms of design firms, can you expect a perfect set of construction documents? And the way we ask people is something that would withstand, you know, basically unlimited scrutiny by contractors and fabricators, and just no mistakes, and there's just no omissions. Is that even possible? And it was pretty interesting to see that only 7% of owners said it was possible, but 13% of architects said it was possible. I mean, even more architects said it was possible than owners. But then we said to owners, is it reasonable to expect that, though, even though only 7% say it's possible, 21% said it's reasonable. So again, this is a really important disconnect, and you got to realize that you've got a whole lot of people who, even though they realize it's not possible, are still going to walk into that project team meeting expecting perfection. You've got to talk this stuff out intelligently in advance and identify the things that are unrealistic about that. And here you've got Chuck Hardy saying the expectation should always be you're going to get the best set ever, if not perfect, on every single job. So that's what the owner's thinking. And then in terms of the cost of design mistakes, if we acknowledge the fact, right, that there's baked-in uncertainty, which is going to cause issues in errors and omissions issues in those contract documents, what is a reasonable amount to allocate for that? So first we asked owners, we said, do you think you will never have a problem going forward? All right. 12%, only 12%, thankfully, said that they think that they should never have any problems going forward. 80% said, I understand, I acknowledge the fact that there's going to be design errors on my future projects. So then what we got into is, what do you believe is a reasonable range for a normal additional cost that's going to be due to non-negligent design mistakes in those construction documents? And it went everywhere from 0 to, frankly, north of 20%. But the average came out in that 3 to 5% range. And nobody's ever done this before in my career, has actually quantified this kind of an impact number to get 115 major owners who do complex projects in the U.S. to go on record saying, on average, actually something in the 3 to 5% range is acceptable for a cost overrun and cost impact due to mistakes in construction documents. And Chuck Hardy said it. He says, I think we're 3 to 5% close. Hey, man, that's probably a good number. This is really important stuff. And again, you know, you now have a tool to take to an owner and say, look, and here's what 115 objective owners said is a reasonable expectation for standard of care is somewhere in that 3 to 5% range, not the 0% range. So in terms of measuring the build side of the team, the thing that came out number one is that ability to solve issues without grandstanding and escalating it to the owner. You know, that scored highest with everybody, that collaborative performance. And Chuck Hardy says, you know, once a contractor gets in the driver's seat, that's a great metric. And if they're doing that right, most of the rest of these that you'll see in a second here would be minimized. So in terms of percentage of construction costs, these are those hard numbers, the number of change orders, percentage contingency used, no errors. These are things which everybody feels more comfortable holding a contractor to because they actually have more control over these things. And you can see, especially the owners, those dark bars are fairly long all the way through there. But Don Vitek says, construction is not an exact science. Everybody wants it to be, but it's not. So it's not that there's an issue, but it's how does that contractor recover from that issue? And I think for all the contractors in the audience, this is a really important quote to take to your owners because it gets it off of the fact that there were issues and it gets it onto how good are you at dealing with those issues, because that's really what they should be focused on, what they should be measuring, and what they should be paying you for. So again, we get into this thing of number of change orders on a project, and you see contractors are least interested in having that being held to that. And Don Vitek says a great thing, change orders come from a lot of different places. Some are good, and they benefit the end product. It's not enough just to judge it on numbers. Is a 100 change order project worse than a 20? You can't say that. Right? So this is really enlightened wisdom. So then in terms of the same perfection question, is it even possible to have perfect construction performance? And where 7% of owners said it's possible to do perfect construction documents, got a lot more thinking that it is actually possible to have a perfect construction performance. And then we asked the same thing about the reasonableness of expecting it, and now you get about 3/4 of owners saying they think it's actually reasonable. So where only maybe 20% of owners thought it was reasonable to expect perfect CDs, he got the vast majority actually thinking that they can hold the construction team to perfect performance. So it's really, this isn't all about errors and omissions in construction documents by any means. It's really important for contractors to, again, also have this kind of mature discussion, really look at the project that you're doing, identify the things in advance which are likely to cause problems, and just accept it and acknowledge it, and don't hide from it, don't be afraid of it, don't be ashamed of it. It's real. And we've pulled together the data here to back some of this stuff up. So lastly, what we looked at was opportunities for performance improvement. And it's not as if we're prescribing these things, but what we've done is we asked folks to say, in your experience so far, what have you found to be helpful? And so this is the last third of the report and a pretty interesting aspect of it. And I think this may provide some interesting fuel going forward for us to do some other things. But we looked at 13 different factors, and we had everybody rate these. The owners, the design teams, the construction teams, from no impact to very high impact, same thing, that 1 to 5. And they broke down into sort of basic topics: the importance of the owner's role, things which were about better integration and collaboration, using building information modeling technologies, how you put the team together and how you approach the project delivery strategy, and then the importance of the budget contingency. So taking a look at how some of these things came out in terms of the most impactful factors that are going to help to reduce the overall uncertainty, you're seeing that this more integration is absolutely came out the #1 most important, very strong alignment between all the parties on that. The definition of deliverables, very strong alignment on that. And Eric Miller from Sutter Health, if any of you are familiar with them, they do more IPD than anybody else out there. They were one of the early pioneers in it and still do a great deal of IPD. And what Eric Miller says, that open conversation, the open platform, the big room, whatever you want to call it, has helped it. Conversation drives documents that are constructible. And if you go back to the very beginning, that was the #1 most valued thing about the contribution of the design team that people are looking for, is that constructible set of documents. Secondly, came out things around the owner's role. Direction especially strong from the architects. As Chuck Hardy will say, an informed owner solves a lot of problems on a project. You can have great contractors, subs, architects, engineers. If the owner isn't driving it, they'll all be hamstrung. Again, this is a terrific quote to take to an owner to really encourage them to be engaged, and great data from the industry to encourage them to become more engaged. And as Craig Russell says, because they pick the team and they design the strategy, they have the ultimate responsibility for the outcome. Coming in third of these in terms of those clusters, really more around that best value, team selection, use of CM. The primary reason is that they have the responsibility in one place versus two, and tying it together contractually. And that's why Whirlpool does as much design build as they do. And then lastly, the last cluster here around contingency and owner budget and the use of BIM. If teams are coming into the project like-minded around BIM, it definitely helps reduce the overall uncertainty. Eric Miller of Sutter Health, they're big BIM users as well as IPD. So what we did was we went back to the original 7 top causes, if you remember from the first part, and we gridded those against what some of these mitigation factors there on the left. So across the top, you'll see those 7 top drivers of uncertainty, and then the average in the far right, and then down the vertical are some of the top scoring mitigation factors. And then we did another, 1 to 100 scaling of it. And so you can see there are the things which in the dark red, the highest scores. This is really where you're getting a lot of lift. You're getting really moving the needle around owner-driven changes, accelerated schedule, all the stuff around better communication, greater leadership, and then things, on the lower right, which aren't nearly as impactful. So getting to that aspect of contingencies, this was a really interesting aspect of this. We had Jerry Lee from Hines, for instance, saying that they take 3% of the construction contract amount and they give it to their staff in the field, and they fully expect that 3% of that construction contract amount is going to be needed in the field a little at a time here and there just to cover all the stuff that normally occur. I mean, that is so enlightened. Just imagine everybody's life if all major owners, and not just Jerry Lee and Hines, did that. I mean, it just makes us so much smarter to get through the project. But you can see how often owners actually do contingencies. You're seeing that it happens quite a lot. 81% of the owners say that they always have a contingency. But then we said, how often do you tell anybody about it? Half the owners always tell the design teams. A third always tell the construction team. John Mobius goes even further, Crate and Barrel. He basically shares his entire pro forma with his design team. So everybody understands if something comes up with this unbought scope or something, everybody sees the numbers and sees where it's going to come out of. And then you look at how many never tell. Half of owners also never tell. So it's 25%, I'm sorry, never tell, and 37% never tell the build team. So you really have a lot of discrepancy in terms of what owners do once they have established a contingency, in terms of how much they actually share it with the team so that they can work together. And what Boyd Black from the University of Chicago said, interestingly, he says, I found it to be a constant fight with the design team. Why? I'm not letting them use that money. All right, so the takeaway here is, if you want to have this information shared with you, you have to be responsible about not considering it to be part of your project budget, but indeed it is for special situations. Then we asked owners, do you have a real standard way of actually developing a contingency in a project? Or do you just, use the same 5% all the time, no matter what? And indeed, it turns out that 2/3 really don't have any actual prescribed standard risk assessment process by which they develop a contingency. And only 24% said they did. So there's an awful lot of kind of invention on the fly out there going on around establishing a really important aspect of a project, which is that financial project contingency. So we see that this could be a very important thing for us to focus on going forward. Is there a way you could profile a project in advance across maybe 12 different categories and score it and say, a project like this, really ought to have a 20% contingency in it versus a project like that, which you could get by with a 2% because it doesn't have those same drivers. There is none of that out there, and it's incredibly important. And these are the kinds of things that, without that sort of a standardized way of doing it, you really have to deal with this with conversations as early as you can with your owners. So, in summary, looking at the overall here, it was kind of interesting to see how the controlling party for each of those factors of uncertainty generally kind of underperceives the impact of the causes that are under their particular control and tends to point to the others around the table as being the ones who are really more importantly driving that uncertainty. The causes under the contractors' control themselves had the least impact, but the contractors were actually the most willing to sort of stand up to it. But at the same time, they're the ones who were seen as benefiting the most from uncertainty. So, you know, what this does is it points to the fact that we really have very different perceptions around the table. And unless you try and address those intelligently early on with an intelligent, informed conversation with the kind of data we're trying to give folks here, you're just going to run into traditional kinds of problems later on in the project, which are going to be almost unavoidable. In terms of expectations, I was actually pretty surprised at how much less owners were satisfied with architectural and construction performance than that was perceived by those who were providing it, because I certainly thought I was always doing a bang-up job. So it's, again, pretty interesting to just acknowledge the fact that there's a real perception difference there, especially around cost and schedule, more so than quality. You had a lot of varying perspectives on what ought to be measured for design and construction performance, and perfect performance was actually seen more realistic for construction than design. So I think that build teams are being held to a higher level of expectation than design teams are. In terms of opportunities for performance improvement, you know, the metrics is that matrix is in the report. There's a lot of other breakdown in the report that gets into a great deal more detail about it, so I'd refer you to that. But there was a fair amount of alignment around what some of these potential mitigations could be against some of those causes. But the thing which was shocking to me, and I think really needs a lot of work out there, is the lack of science behind establishing and allocating contingencies. So the report, much like most of our other reports, it's got some really interesting case studies in it. One that really sings the praises of a high level of end-user engagement, the Mozilla headquarters, interesting design-build stories, IPD stories, minimizing uncertainty through what Creighton Barrow calls design-build bid, where they actually do design-build on certain aspects and they very aggressively bid other aspects. And so, again, these can be very useful both for you and to share with owners that you work with, to say there's different ways to go about things which have other people have found have really brought down the level of uncertainty and the negative impact thereof. There's also a series of sidebars, which are, again, typical of what we'll do in these SmartMarket reports. There's commentary all the way through from that owner advisory group, and I can't steer you strongly enough towards that because there's so much wisdom in that. We also deal with how lean processes have been able to reduce uncertainty. We talk specifically about how BIM helps manage uncertainty. We have claims consultants talking to us about this issue and how they deal with it. And then the cost of imperfection, we pulled together some secondary research on reducing error-induced uncertainty.